Hello and welcome to episode number 447 of the Armen Show, Science, People, Creativity, Learning More. Today we are covering interesting topics: sustainability, aquaculture, the oceans. We have a returning guest on from before and a new guest. Our returning guest today, Professor Jennifer Jacquet. She's at the University of Miami. We previously discussed the playbook and corporations and what they do. Jennifer, I would like to first thank you for coming on to the program.
Thank you.
And glad to have you on. And our guest joining us was also co-authored papers with Jennifer at NYU. We have Professor Becca Franks. Becca, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
I'm glad to have both of you on. How cool is it that you have worked on papers together? This is something I'm fond of when there is research together, teamwork. How did you guys meet of each other in the first place and get started in the intersectional information you are putting out? Either of you.
I'll take this one because I believe, as is normal in anybody's relationship with Becca, that I reached out to her. I was introduced to her by a mutual friend of ours who also did her PhD in the same lab that Becca worked in. And she knew I was going to Vancouver, and she said, "There's a woman there you have to meet. She's studying fish. She's doing it in this really neat, unconventional way. You have to see and meet. You have to see the fish tanks, and you have to meet her." And so I went, and a collaboration was born. And Becca also then returned to New York and actually became a professor in the same department I was working in before I left. So that was all wonderful. I guess we've known one another for almost a decade now. So
I think so. I think a full decade.
That is quite cool. Building a relationship over time, there's a network of connections and experiences that come up with that. Becca, knowing Jennifer over this time, what are some elements where you guys have connected as far as concepts you have put out there or things you have been interested in covering?
Wow, it's hard to sort of list them all. I think the main thing that we connected over is a deep love of aquatic animals and aquatic ecosystems. I think to a point that I just really appreciate Jennifer's like unapologetic passion for and yeah, just seeing the ocean and aquatic animals and the inhabitants, other inhabitants of the ocean as just being like unqualified things to protect and celebrate and be in awe of, and doing that in a sort of rigorously academic way as well, has been just like a real, I guess, inspiration for me. And I think the main sort of, I would say I'd be interested to hear what Jennifer thinks, but like the main sort of like contact point of our collaboration.
yeah, I would add only
Love
that
this, Jennifer.
I agree, and I would say that I worked on fisheries in a fisheries program for my PhD. I'd also studied climate change, and I was interested in these two things as global systems and as major human impacts on global systems. But when you study fisheries, that does not mean you're studying fish. And as a result, you can have a lot of appreciation for the animals in the ocean, what's happening to them. You can understand the overexploitation. But Becca was doing fish behavior, and she was doing it in a new way, as I mentioned. She was thinking about fish not only as individuals, but as individuals who had positive emotions, who would be interested in playing and expressing their curiosity. And a lot of people haven't taken fish seriously in that respect. And so I think a good complementary relationship was born in part through my understanding and appreciation of the kind of human exploitation of these animals, and her fundamental understanding of the animals themselves, or at least some subset of those animals, because as we might get into, it's a really large, disparate group that we call fish.
This is true. I have quite a bit of connection with the fish community. I have two friends here. They're the top surf fishermen in Southern California, and they're very about sustainability, and working with catch and release is their item, and then maintaining the fish sections, and they contact the local councils about marine protected areas and things like this. So they're always keeping track of where people should be able to fish, the boats, and so they have a lot of conflicts with boat fishermen and different categories of that. So it got me into this space more than I would have been previously, and so it's become more noticeable to myself. When it comes to fish sustainability and how we maintain the oceans as they are, where are the biggest categories where there are issues right now that come to mind? Becca.
Well, I can speak to one aspect of it. It's not necessarily the biggest threat to the oceans themselves, but it could be. And I think Jennifer can speak to the oceans. But one of the areas that I'm really focused on right now is the expansion of aquaculture, which is the farming of aquatic organisms. And this expansion has increased in terms of like just the tonnage, the raw tonnage of fish and other aquatic organisms that are being now farmed dramatically in the past several decades, such that, you know, half of the food fish that we're eating globally is now thought to come from farmed sources rather than the oceans or ponds and rivers and lakes. So that is a radical change in the food and where it's coming from that's in the global system. But that expansion isn't just in terms of tonnage. It's also expanded in terms of the number of species that are being farmed, from just a very small handful of species that have been farmed historically, like 3, to now there's hundreds of different species. And these species are wild animals that we know very, very little about. And we're subjecting them to extreme production systems that are optimized for productivity, not for the well-being of the animals. And so it's set up for harm and cruelty and exploitation. And then, of course, not just the number of species, but there's, you know, the number of individual animals has increased, which obviously goes hand in hand with the increase in the tonnage. But now there's probably as many individual fishes being farmed totally, globally, comparable to all of the other animals being farmed. So all of the chickens and pigs and cows and ducks and turkeys, you add all of them up, is now matched by all of the fish being farmed in the world.
It's a substantial amount right there.
Yeah, I would
Jennifer.
just say that to fill in maybe the kind of potential gap that you're seeing, as I studied, as I mentioned, fisheries, which we tend to think of as capture fisheries, but you can't really study the capture of wild fish or the exploitation of wild fish without bumping up against aquaculture, because so much of actually the fish that we catch goes to feed farmed fish. So this began to get my attention. Becca and I began talking about it quite a bit and really have come to see it as a kind of watershed moment. We're seeing not only in terms of numbers and tonnage, you know, this accelerated growth in aquaculture, but really moving forward without taking any of the lessons that we've learned from all the terrestrial factory farming that we have done. So we just see this as a really big research gap, of course, but even more fundamentally a sort of policy gap in terms of, I think Becca and I both think we need to put the brakes on aquaculture a little bit as we try to understand what we're doing exactly, what all the risks are. And it's clear that we really have to move aquaculture in a different direction at the very least, if not sort of stop the expansion altogether. So we've been talking a lot about those issues published in those domains, both in terms of animal welfare, but also I think we're both really interested in this this framing of sort of the rapid domestication of marine species that are happening, and what that means for how we see the oceans, how we think about our food systems, the ecological and animal impacts of that. And so again, you get all these aspects of, I think, science that wind up being important. The exploitation of wild fish, the expansion and growth of farming, the animal behavior and welfare questions, and you need to assemble teams, in other words, to sort of address these questions with any kind of sophistication. No one person could do it by themselves.
So I wanted to mention one thing. You both have a joint paper away from an offshore aquaculture industry in the United States. There's industrial aquaculture and environmental impacts. What are some of the environmental impacts that we are seeing currently? Will they increase over time? What are we looking at as far as the environment?
Well, I'll just briefly mention it. Sort of pairs nicely with what Jennifer was just saying, that the farming of carnivorous species, of which we are doing a lot of, we wouldn't farm a tiger. We wouldn't dream of farming wolves. But we're farming the equivalent of those animals in aquaculture and the expansion of aquaculture. And just to put some traction on it, we're farming species that are top predators, that require animal protein as part of their diet. They're not omnivores, they are obligate carnivores. And so, you have species like salmon, Atlantic salmon, that are they eat other fish, they eat insects, they require animal protein basically to survive. Many different species of fish are carnivores, and we're farming them. And so what that means is that to grow them to a size that then they can be sold commercially requires a lot more input from outside of the system. So you have to bring in fish that have been caught, in the oceans to feed them. And then that is energy intensive in a way that's not true. For example, herbivore grazing or a passive filter feeder like a bivalve that doesn't require that energy input. So it's straining the ecosystems and it's straining the environment in the sense of requiring greater energy inputs for many of the species in aquaculture. But one of the things that, is a real blind spot when we talk about aquaculture is that it's an incredibly diverse sector. So, if you talk about farming, for example, and we think of terrestrial farming, yes, of course, some forms of farming are incredibly polluting and energy intensive, and then other forms of farming are not so intensive and energy polluting or energy requiring. And the exact same is true for aquaculture. So there is part of aquaculture is farming seaweeds, for example. Part of aquaculture is farming bivalves, which are passive filter feeders, so like oysters, clams, and mussels. And there can be good ways of farming the seaweed, bad ways of farming the seaweed, good ways of farming the bivalves, bad ways, there's a massive amount of diversity. So the point is to actually get some specificity in this sector and break down the hype that it's just, we're going to farm aquatic species and it's going to, address food security and be friendlier on the planet. That is a oversimplification and gloss that's borderline on sort of steering into, insincere is not the right word, but what's the word I'm looking for?
Misinformation, at least, at the very least.
Misinformation. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add that Becca and I think we're very fortunate to be in a Department of Environmental Studies at NYU. Now I'm in a Department of Environmental Science and Policy. These are not beholden to the industry the way that an animal sciences department is in a state school, for instance. And so we also, I think, have the benefit of bringing different values beyond just instrumental value to even the scientific questions. So I think a lot of aquaculture research and fisheries research has been about how can we get more out of the oceans for human use. And here we are expanding the view of aquaculture to ask, what are the lives like for the animals? What are the broader impacts on the food systems? For instance, we actually have figured out ways to reduce the amount of fish in to fish out for aquaculture over the years. But one area that the science has been very weak in is showing how we've done that and what those trade-offs have meant. So for instance, we still require more fish into the system than we get out, which most food systems people would say is an unwise situation. You're losing animals and protein to have this higher value end product. But even if you consider those efficiency gains in fish in, fish out, a few people have looked at the trade-offs, which has resulted in more farming of food crops, basically, more water use, more land dedicated to the feed crops. And so this trade-off is not without expense. And so the point I think that we both would like to see in the aquaculture conversation is to have a more sophisticated, more robust conversation that includes many different kinds of values, not just how can we exploit these animals to their maximum potential for human use, but also the idea that we value the oceans as they are. We may not want to colonize all of the oceans for human use. That we may value the lives of these animals, the kind of life that they live, that we may want to think about the food system as a whole and how sustainable it is. We may want to think about who these animals ultimately are feeding, whether or not they're going to hungry people or whether they're going to food secure markets, as it mainly appears to be. And so Becca and I have worked on the paper you mentioned and many others to try to expand the conversation, expand the science, expand the research to bring in this broader view of aquaculture.
I've always been fond of broader view because you're taking into account more, it has a longer term element to it where, okay, this is going to affect those individuals. Is it actually helping those people? What's happening with the ocean? Versus if it's a shorter term view, it looks great as far as numerically right now, but later on we'll have a dilemma that we didn't want to have in the first place. How does one take into account some more numbers that are not currently being taken into account, and including things like fish sentience and welfare in aquaculture politics?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. I think there's the core one core problem that we have is actually the language. So we have this one word fish that covers over 30,000 different species. And not only do we have that one word fish, I think there's also a literal mental model of what a fish looks like, you know, that little sort of teardrop shape with like a little triangle on the end. So that word, that image can get in the way of seeing the world clearly. It obscures our vision and it obscures our thinking. And so one of the things that we can do is sort of try to bring some more specificity and granularity into the animals that we're discussing here. So, you know, you'd never lump together sort of chickens and cows. They're obviously incredibly different beings. But when we talk about fish and aquaculture and fish welfare and the risks to fish, we're lumping together a fish like a tilapia with potentially like an Atlantic halibut. And the tilapia, you know, is like a freshwater fish that has stable social relationships. They take care of their offspring, so they do mouth brooding. They have territories that they maintain and nests and long-term relationships with each other. And the Atlantic halibut, for example, is a marine species, a totally different environment. They're a benthic fish. They spend most of their time on the bottom of the ocean. They're incredibly flat and sort of not the standard way of thinking about a fish. They can live over 100 years. They go on massive migrations in the seamounts of the North Atlantic. You can imagine that we know very, very little about their lives because they live in such remote and hard to observe spaces. It's possible that, you know, they have a rich life around these migration routes that we just know nothing about. And yet we're farming both of them, and it gets both labeled and lumped together under, you know, fish, this one singular word. They're as different as chickens and cows. And so one of the things that I think is part of the work that I'm doing, because I'm interested in the welfare of these animals, that I wasn't anticipating being part of the work, is just to highlight the diversity, highlight the specificity of the lives, highlight even the specificity of the body plans that they have. You know, this mental model that we have of this image of a teardrop with a triangle is not true. There's a vast number of like shapes and sizes and body plans and colors and ages and, you know, social structures. So I think just learning, first of all, realizing that we have a problem in that we imagine that fish is a singular thing, you know, that can cover, I know that's just a fish. You know, that is impossible actually, because there's kind of no such thing as a fish. And then actually understanding that we don't have a lot of information about their lives. And in the absence of having information, how should we think about what their lives might be like? Should we think of their lives as being essentially empty and vapid and vacant? Or perhaps there's just more to discover about their personalities, their preferences, the way that they view and perceive the world, how they process information, what they're curious about. And instead it's like an unknown to be discovered rather than taking that absence of information as evidence of nothing going on.
And in that vein, you know, we have a paper together that Becca led, looking at also just the large data set, right, where you're looking at at that time 408 species that were being farmed at the time. And so to Becca's point about the diversity of those individuals, we won't be able to just though science our way out of this question. Like, oh, if we just got more information about their lives, we would be able to give them a good life. Because of the richness of the number of species, because of how little we know. I think it was something like we have 0 papers for about 70% of the individuals being farmed right now, 0 science. We won't be able to just simply say, oh, a 5-year research program will solve this problem. That we, again, when you talk about how can we stop the expansion of aquaculture, that some of it is about understanding the limits to our own knowledge in this area and saying, whoa, let's not add more species. Since the time we wrote that paper, we've added even more species into aquaculture production. We were just reading a paper about bullfrog farming. We haven't even talked on this program yet about the invertebrates or octopus farming, which Becca and I are also interested in stopping mainly. And so we're trying to argue on the basis of how little we know, again, for not further accelerating and adding to the number of species under production.
The point that Becca brought up and that you followed up on there is about putting things into a small category. I've never been fond of that because let's say I'm saying to someone I read a book, then I'm thinking maybe a nonfiction science book, but they might be thinking of a fiction book, could be an audiobook, could be whatever variation of what they're thinking of, maybe an anime book. And so we're talking about a completely different thing under the guise of it being a book. So that's not really informative and doesn't get much done as far as information or communication because we're not speaking the same thing, even though it's in that category. That happens a lot in life, that the bigger picture item is used because that's the simplest thing for everybody. But it's not good for really detailed items or important work that requires specialization because you're missing 80% of the point for that thing. And it sounds like you're doing good effort for it, but it's not really making progress for what matters. And we're getting better at specialization over time, which is a nice feature that comes to mind.
Yeah.
That's one cool one.
Yeah, sorry, if I can just pick up on there because it's really related to what Jennifer was just talking about in our collaboration. So I have a background being trained as an animal welfare scientist, and most of animal welfare science historically has focused on chickens, pigs, and cows. That's the origins of the field. And it's expanded out to cover laboratory animals and companion animals and zoo animals and whatnot. But so that was my background training. And then coming into this aquaculture space, I was thinking about, oh, like, how do we do animal welfare science? And basically the way you do animal welfare science is that you try to understand a great deal about a species, like a chicken, for example, and then understand like what kind of bedding do they need, how much outdoor access, what their social structure is like, how badly is the current system, impacting, their lives, and how you sort of do a triage essentially. And so when Jennifer and I just started this project looking at the animal welfare information for animals in aquaculture, I saw these, there's, like she mentioned, there's over 400 different species compared to like less than 20 in the terrestrial system. So that's just immediately a much, much bigger task that is being presented to the field, and there's fewer people studying fish welfare than there is on the other side. So and then we did this analysis about each species, how much do we know about their welfare, and then we can look at that against how large the production system is. So there were some species that immediately jumped out to me as there's massive production systems, billions of individuals who are being farmed around the world in a complete absence of any information about what their lives are like. So as an animal welfare scientist, that's where my mind was drawn, that this is like setting off alarm bells to these handful of species and huge production without any information. But then the more we talked about it, I realized, or Jennifer helped me to realize, that this whole sector has a completely different dynamic to it than regular animal welfare science, where it's like, oh, regular animal welfare science, we find out about the animals and we try to like make the production systems friendlier to their welfare. That's impossible in aquaculture because there's hundreds of species being farmed, maybe at very low production levels. There's no way to fill in that knowledge gap. So this is what she means by we can't science our way out of it. We can't fill in that knowledge gap. And it's not a knowledge gap, it's a knowledge canyon or a knowledge chasm. There's no backfilling our way out of it. It would take hundreds of years. And in the meantime, we're just continuing to expand the number of species. So it's a distinct policy response and a distinct societal response and a distinct scientific response is required in aquaculture, because we can't just take the sort of playbook from terrestrial animal welfare and apply it, and we're just like, oh, we'll just learn about these species and figure out how to triage. So instead, what we started talking about is actually just how can we sort of have some policy mechanisms or some societal, buy-in to the idea that this expanding to more species is just a bad idea. That's the problem, is the expansion to new species, because then we're just creating more problems for ourselves down the line.
And you picked up,
This is
Armen,
related
on
to
the book idea, fish, the body plan, and sort of lumping all these categories together, and no book is like another. Becca's really got me thinking, and this is not about policing language. I think we're past that politically. But what we would like to see is an expansion again of our imaginations. And sometimes the language artificially constrains our imaginations. And one way that that's also happened is people referring to fish or aquatic animals as our ancestors. And Becca's pointed out, like, they act like fish are frozen in time, right? They're prehistoric, or they're right here living alongside of us. They've been evolving the same for the same time period. They've been eking out a living. These really are our cousins. These are as sophisticated and as evolved as any other. And so we've sort of been curious again in the ways that the conversations have been artificially constrained and need to be expanded due to the language, and I think more the mental models that come with the language on how we think about these animals and therefore how we plan for their future.
There's a couple of important points there. Having more imagination is very valuable. I always see that. Being able to see more, connect more things, I always find that valuable. And what you just mentioned there, the the language is very limiting in some regards, and we want it to be expansive so that it include all the variables. The more we get data analytics that includes more variables, we're like, oh, we figured this out, but we weren't able to do it when we only handled 3 or 4 variables at a time. But when we have 15 or 20, the more we handle, suddenly, oh, this is more matching reality. And then the point you brought up there about fish is very valuable. They have been going along with us, so to talk about them like we're looking at a tribe from long ago doesn't really make sense, because we've been working together along the way, along with other organisms.
We're we're as much their ancestors as they are our ancestors. It's like you can flip it, and then you realize how insane it sounds to imagine that we're the ancestor of a pufferfish. It sounds like I'm talking crazy, but it's equivalently crazy to imagine that a pufferfish is our ancestor.
And we have other scientific models that have encouraged that line of thinking, like this famous book that I love called Your Inner Fish. So that sort of build on this idea that fish are somehow prehistoric, and then the mammals built on, and the reptiles built on this model. We have to break those ideas, concepts down, so that we can return to, I think, the real state of affairs and have a greater appreciation for the animals themselves and what we're doing to them.
One thing you brought up earlier was, I want to get back to it because I'll forget about it if I don't before I go to the next question. Octopi, they're so interesting and intelligent. They are not mentioned so much, but anytime I've seen some sort of footage of them, they look like super geniuses. What is happening in that landscape, and are they paid enough attention to? What matters in that domain?
I mean, I'll jump in because I love that you love them. I love that this has been achieved somehow culturally without even necessarily the science, but through these other means. And one thing that we all must give octopuses is that their intelligence is both alien, some people use the word, and also highly recognizable to us. I mean, this is a feat of theirs. I would not want to suggest that just because they're incredibly special and we can recognize the kind of sophistication and curiosity and intelligence they have, that other animals are lacking that. But it is quite special that they've sort of convinced us without much science that they are so spectacular. We give a lot of credit, of course, to the images and short videos that people have seen, and then a lot of that had been done in captivity in aquaria and maybe even on sort of fishing boats or as a result of exploitation. And then, of course, you have this incredible film, My Octopus Teacher, that comes out while everyone's stuck at home during the pandemic and shows us what octopuses or how Octopus vulgaris looks in the wild in their own habitat, which really, again, breaks down the mental model that we had of them sort of being escape artists, right? We've heard that. Like, well, they're only escape artists because we put them in captivity. Now we see them in their own habitat, and we really can appreciate even more fully how special they are. And at the same time, the incredible paradox is that we are subjecting them right now to plans for commercial exploitation, for mass production. There's an octopus farm planned on the Canary Islands, financed by largely the Spanish government and this company called Pesca Nueva. And Becca and I have led work to try to stop, to voice the scientific opinion to try to stop this enterprise. And then there are a number of civil society groups leading the charge, and activists within the U.S. and beyond leading state-level octopus farming bans, trying to preemptively stop mass production of octopus before it starts. But it's a great example of it being also octopuses aren't even fish. They're invertebrates. Typically, we tend to think even less of invertebrates than we do of fish. And so octopuses are sort of turning, again, those mental models on their heads in ways that I think are really compelling and really exciting and show us just what's possible maybe moving forward.
The example, by the way, the words escape artist, that's another great example of where a description is put on, but if you talk to the octopus, it might say, I'm just trying to do my thing, and so maybe I'm not such, you're calling me an escape artist, but that's my maybe fight or flight response to something, but then it's complimented in that way, so then it's described the wrong way. And now you're like, oh, we should have them escape because that's what they're experts at. And now you have an organism doing something it's not built to do in that way. Now, this is related to the playbook. You had work on shame and social approval. How can that shift consumer behavior or corporate practices in seafood consumption? Shame and social approval.
Well, I mean, I think what I was just mentioning about Pesca Nueva, so it's experienced a lot of exposure for its octopus farming plans, and it's been the target of a lot of bad press over octopus farming in all sorts of European and US media. I think it's a good example of how also these state laws, which have now passed in Washington, California, one is set to be voted upon in Hawaii. It's being discussed in New York, Connecticut, Florida. These state level bans can send a signal through to the markets, and I think, show that there's a little interest in octopus farming. But I guess we're still sort of testing and hoping that the octopus farming case could be a kind of bellwether for aquaculture generally, and a question of could it be a kind of foundation for then again preventing the expansion further, because there is a lot of public support for octopuses, much less again for something like a bullfrog. And so could we sort of use them as an umbrella species somehow? That is so down the road, but I will say that there's also federal legislation introduced in the US. Of course, now is not the time to talk about federal legislation, but it will be, I think, reintroduced this spring as well by Senator Whitehouse and Murkowski of Alaska for a federal octopus farming ban in the United States. And again, this is just it's just the tip of the iceberg. It's not sufficient. It's not perfect, but it is a kind of move in the direction that I think there's a strong scientific basis for.
Now, this one here is connected to Dr. Frank's core research questions that she has. How are ocean animals specifically affected by the Anthropocene?
Yeah, unfortunately, they're hit in a lot of different ways. Some similar, some different from the terrestrial system. Before I even get into the details, I think just, echoing and reinforcing some of what we've been saying, just from a slightly different angle. One of the things that I've been really sort of interested in is thinking about how little exposure we have to ocean systems and ocean ecosystems. So, and I think this, again, creates some sort of stumbling block when we're trying to think clearly about what's happening. So if you show someone a picture of a rainforest that's been deforested or bulldozed down or is burning, it has a sort of gut level impact on us. We feel it viscerally. You understand what the trees were like that used to be there. You understand, the diversity of animal life and fungi life and plant life that was there. Even if you haven't been to the rainforest, it's something that is probably familiar to most people. With the oceans, it's so much less familiar to us. And in terms of actual exposure, most humans don't spend, essentially you can round it down to 0% of their life in the ocean. There's, of course, snorkeling enthusiasts and free divers and, people working on ocean vessels and stuff like that. But actually spending time underwater amongst free living beings in an ocean ecosystem, it's essentially 0. So we have this so we don't have the availability of the standard normal way things should be available to us. So when we're talking about ocean ecosystem threats from the Anthropocene, the baseline is not even where one would want it to be of more full, complete appreciation of what exists before we even begin talking about what is being destroyed. Because, ocean ecosystems are incredibly diverse. There's not one single ocean ecosystem. the classic example of the coral reef is one of the most intricate, co-evolved, interdependent ecosystems with just mind-bending things happening on the reef in terms of multi-species communities, and fish changing their gender or their sex as they age, being born as a male and turning into a female as you get higher status, like collaborating with each other to go on hunting expeditions, to make discoveries, shoaling and schooling together, so that you're in this incredibly, and that's just one ecosystem of many in the oceans. So just first to sort of like acknowledge that there's a lot going on before we even start talking about the losses, but then the losses are similar to what we're seeing on land in terms of habitat destruction. The coral reefs are, from coral reefs being destroyed, creating shipping channels, to trawling, turning up the ocean floor so that it's the whole ecosystem of the floor is being upturned, like with a bulldozer, essentially the ocean equivalent of a bulldozer. Pollution from, runoff from agricultural systems. Of course, climate change, and so the systems are warming and heating, and there is a tipping point, coming back to the coral reefs, there's a tipping point for corals, beyond which they literally cannot survive. And without the corals, all of the other species that depend on that system cannot survive. So it's not just like the temperature is getting warmer and then therefore new species will move in. The system will entirely crash. And so you might have heard of coral bleaching, and that's sort of what can happen in those situations where you just get a sudden and complete loss of the entire reef. And then a compounded problem is not only just the temperatures increasing, but also ocean acidification, so that the chemistry of the ocean is changing in a way that is absolutely integral to the inhabitants of the ocean. And then I could go on and on and on. I'll end with dams because, it's not just an issue in the oceans, but, most of the rivers around the world now are dammed, and there's many species that rely on migratory routes, going back and forth and traveling along the river systems that are now being physically blocked from being able to go on their historic routes, where they need to get to their spawning grounds, their breeding grounds, to reproduce, and then back to the ocean in some cases, to feed. So it's like their entire life system depends on this, and it's like the equivalent of if we put up like giant walls across the United States that birds would, and I guess in some ways we're doing that, smash into on their migratory route. So there's all of that plus the aquaculture that we've already been talking about. So it's multifaceted, and yeah, I'm not even through the full list, but I think I'll stop there. It's too depressing.
I'll only add to that litany with, in honor of my PhD supervisor, Diana Pauly, he would want me to bring up the declining oxygen in the system as well due to the warming. And I think that's important, relevant to our conversation so far, because one area that we've also been really constrained by our own imaginations is what it's like to be a water breather and what that means for how you think about the world and move about in it. And because many aquatic animals are water breathers and not air breathers like the mammals in the ocean, they, with warming temperatures and declining oxygen levels, they're migrating, toward the poles, that we know is major biomass movement toward the poles in search of oxygen. And that is just something, again, that I think we don't really consider in terms of the wild animal welfare impacts that the Anthropocene is having.
It would be described as escape towards oxygen artists in that case, but they're just making their way to where they want to be. 2 points that came up in my mind was one, coral reefs. I find them super cool, and one, I did like a talk description thing and found out the way I think about things is kind of like a coral reef because it has all these interesting connections and tries to link things. So I think of my mind kind of like a coral reef. And then the point you brought up about the percentage of time in the ocean, it's close to zero. We only get good at things when we are living in them. Like if you're working on a book or a project or thoughts or a connection or something, when you're living in it, that's where you really handle all the details and whatnot. But when you're looking at it from afar, your expertise is so limited because all you can do is maybe Probably. That could be. Okay, we'll try that. We'll check back in a few years. And then it doesn't have that level of direct feedback because it's not your day to day. You're not actually living, like you're saying, water breathers. There's something about really being in it that cannot be done if you are not in it.
Well, and this is why, but I think that we also can trust experts. I mean, we have Jane Goodall, who knows Gombe, knows the chimpanzees in Gombe, and we've trusted her to be an advocate and spokesperson for chimpanzees. We don't just ask the average person what they think chimpanzees would want. We are much more likely to trust Jane Goodall's opinion, and we need people like Becca Franks who are in the Gombes of the ocean or the aquatic environment to tell us, sort of what these animals, what they would prefer and advocate for them, I think in expert ways.
It means a lot to be actually there. It made me think of Robert Sapolsky. I once had an interview by text, and he worked with apes, and he was actually around apes for years and years and years, and that'll help with understanding what their day-to-day is. Or Vince Pfizer, he studies elements and metals that we need around the world. He'd actually go to the mines, and you get a sense of, oh, okay, this is the mining that's happening. This is what it does to the local community, transfers the air quality, how it affects things. But when you see it from afar, you have no clue. Just on Google Maps, it looks like a rectangle that's colorful. Oh, there's mining being done. Maybe it's super great, but if you're there actually in person, you might think, oh, we are basically scratching at the ground, taking things, and it might mess up things later on if you're not taking into account the full details of it. Now, I brought up a couple of people. You have worked with different people. Interdisciplinary approaches. What kinds of interdisciplinary approaches can be applied to ocean conservation, bringing in things like psychology, anthropology, or environmental studies? Is there any combinations that come to mind that are useful?
I'm actually expanding out into creative practice and collaborating with artists. So I'm working with an artist right now, Marina Zerkow, on thinking about the lateral line that fishes have, which is most fishes on the planet today have what's called a lateral line, which is equivalent of sort of like a sixth sense that they have. It goes down the side of their body, on both sides of their body, and it's a special system to detect water flow. And it also maps the fish's movements onto itself so that if it creates flow, it can understand that flow is coming from itself rather than from the environment. It helps them navigate, it helps them hunt, it helps them escape predators, it helps them shoal, it helps them experience the world. And so it gives them this rich sensory perception that we entirely lack as human beings. And so one of the things that we're sort of working with is sort of like creative imagination and practice to understand, that fish can do more than what we can do in this dimension, and in a bunch of dimensions, but this is just an entry point to consider. But that we can use sort of like immersive practice or guided experiences. We haven't decided exactly what we're going to do yet, but the idea being that to come to this sort of more nuanced, embodied, lived appreciation for the lives at stake that we're talking about, we need also some injection of imagination that hopefully can expand our moral imagination as well. And that can also then feed back into the science. As Jennifer was just saying, like the things that we might want to be tracking about important elements in a fish's life or in a water breather's life, we need to sort of get outside of our own modes of thought and try to reach beyond and have sort of creative practice and artistic interventions help the scientists to think differently about the world so they can bring that new thinking back to the science to ask new questions that wouldn't have occurred to them if they hadn't gone on this sort of like journey. So for me, that's like one of the more exciting areas that's like a really transdisciplinary research effort that I'm engaged in right now.
Yeah, and I think that's really promising. And Becca's goal to try to bring the lives of fishes into the lives of humans feels to me compatible also with why we see such a difference between the attitudes toward birds and fishes. There are really active citizens involved in bird protection all the time. I mean, you can see it in your local lagoon, right? If a dog is off leash, a citizen might even yell at that dog. You see the same behavior on a beach, and it's less likely in the kind of intertidal zone to have the same impact, unless there are birds involved. And so I think that is a really important element. I don't want to downplay the role of citizens in our everyday modes of conservation. But for me, I'm expanding in maybe the opposite direction, which is getting involved more with lawyers and legal scholars to imagine new legal regimes that could change our view of conservation. One of the ways that we're very conservative, I think, again, it has to do with what we think is possible, is something you mentioned right at the start, which is that these fishermen are involved in marine protected areas. Well, marine protected areas are very small areas of the ocean that are closed to fishing. In general, our mental model is that the oceans are open to fishing with small exceptions. There have been arguments through the years, and none of them have sort of caught hold, but I am interested in a world in which the oceans are closed to fishing with small exceptions. And how we go about changing that will require the imagination, it will require understanding the lives of the animals, it will require the sentinel scientists, but it will also require new legal regimes. And so I think working with lawyers is an important component of that, also for the octopus legislation and various other aspects of marine conservation.
That point you bring up right there, I was shocked how much pushback they're two twins, they fish together, how much pushback they got from boat fishermen and others in recent times as their platform has been getting bigger and bigger, based on, oh, you're infringing on, we've been doing this for a while. So there's a lot of really hefty pushback on, let's protect this little area. And you're right, it's not even covering the outside ocean, it's just this local area near where the people are. And they're like, no, how could you say such a thing? And there's a lot of threatening material, back and forth type deal, which is, it's a funny thing when you look at it from far away. Like, it's like two little lizards being like, no, that's my spot. No, that's my spot. Okay.
But then it flips pretty quickly, where people go, I can't imagine, because we have areas like this in Florida, which have now been protected from fishing, that are near shore, where people can just swim. And then they've installed what they call snorkel trails. So people can go in with their family, there are underwater statues, there are some animals, and they know they will be protected from fishing boats and boating activity generally. And now they can't imagine that being taken away. They go, of course, this is our area where we can swim. Now the question is, can we get from there to, now this is an area where humans cannot even go, that we've set aside just for the animals. And, there's a lot of work to be done this century. So I'm glad you're having this podcast and sharing this with all of your millions of followers, because we can use all the help we can get.
I like to mention Florida because I was there a couple of years ago a few times, and then on the near Tampa area, and then the manatees are protected well in some regions around there, and people just know of that, like that's the area for the manatees. Or once it's put into mind, then it's something. But before it's put into mind, it's like, oh, you're infringing upon me. I didn't even know I was being infringed upon, but now I feel infringed. But what about maybe the manatees or other items?
And I lived through that. I was a Florida Fish and Wildlife intern in 2001, and people were still, I think, largely of the mindset that manatee zones were an inconvenience, that they were somehow taking away boater privileges. And it's much more accepted, and manatees themselves are referred to as God's creatures. There's a lot more sympathy, I think, and that was great work done by all sorts of groups. And we have to do that, hopefully not on this piecemeal, species by species way, but with these kind of, umbrella species like manatees or octopuses that can help show us, look, if we carve out a little space for them, some more protections, we'll have more of them, they'll lead better lives, we'll feel better about ourselves.
Lastly, I would want to check with both of you, what is an emerging research question you may have or want to cover, and a message you may have about what you would want people to know in this category like in a simplified form.
What's that?
I'll go whatever order you want.
You go first.
Okay, I'll do mine will be less, I'm sure, imaginative than yours, but one very practical thing that we need and that could be done to dispel, I think, one of the great myths about the exploitation of the oceans, both in terms of fisheries and aquaculture, is to really ask very specifically who these animals are feeding. And we have these really broad strokes. Oh, this 1 billion people are fed by seafood and 1 billion people rely on it, and these grand numbers. And I would really like to see some good empirical work on who fisheries and aquaculture are feeding. We have this really only to the country level, and it's really important, I think, that we get more granular detail and that we have a stronger global picture so that we understand really what's at stake in terms of the trade-offs between the end use of the human consumers and what would potentially be, the results of leaving more fish in the ocean or leaving more fish for other marine predators.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. What I think there's a lot of things that we've discussed that are current projects that I'm really excited about. I think maybe the one that I'd like to speak about is one that I'm working on with a current student, Chowan Chang. Actually, she's the lab manager now. She was a former student of mine, and researcher in my lab. And what she's doing is trying to break that wall that we have between our lives and the fish's lives. And so she's trained as a free diver, which means she can hold her breath and go underwater for minutes up to a time. And the alternative to that is, A, to not go down there at all, B, to snorkel, but then you're stuck to the surface, or B, to scuba dive, which allows you to be underwater for extended periods of time. But the nature of the scuba equipment is that you have to stay essentially mostly horizontal to the seafloor, and you're expelling air every time you breathe out. So it's very noisy, and there's studies that have shown that it's quite disruptive to the animals around. So in what her practice, because she's holding her breath, she's able to spend these extended periods of time. She can, move her body in any different direction, which means that she can actually have a embodied experience that's more similar to the fish's experience. And so she's been sort of testing out what can be discovered by engaging in this practice in the same way that Jane Goodall did, where you go to the same site over and over and over, and you get to know particular individuals' personality and their individual characteristics, rather than having some species level understanding or group level understanding. And what she's discovering, which no one has ever really done before, so there's so much to learn here. And, one possibility was that, their lives are very straightforward, but we're finding exactly the opposite, that, they're living these multi-species lives where you're having different species affiliate with each other and form relationships with each other in a way that I think is at least a little bit surprising to the way we think of, ourselves as being like, oh, when you're social, it means social with other humans. It doesn't mean social with a multi-species world. But it seems like these reef fishes, social has more to do with like you're interacting with all these other species and creating social norms and practices and signals. And one of the fish who she got to know well over a summer of doing this is a schooling species that generally goes from reef to reef and doesn't, stay in one place. But one individual of this species decided to take up residence on this particular reef and developed a relationship with everybody else on the reef. And then when this individual's other, original school would come by, she'd chase them off. So like the idea that like there's only one way to be a fish is not true. The idea that there's only one way to be a particular, if you're of a certain species, there's just a huge amount of variety and richness to be discovered. And I think that this sort of way of doing it unlocks a lot of information that can be gathered to speak to sort of why would we care? Why would we care about these animals? I think that taking this approach and the specificity of the way she's doing it really can lead to a lot of like meaningful understanding to fill out our conception of what's going on under the water.
I like that message. It includes variation and ability to see the details versus it's just this and that's it, and it's not really figured out. That's wonderful. Becca and Jennifer, I would like to thank you both for joining on this episode discussing aquaculture, oceans, sustainability, and more, and connecting back with material from also a past talk about the playbook that related to that. Glad to have you both on.
Thank you, Armen.
Thank you so much for having us. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Me too. And we are out.